Hello everyone, I'm Nayaswami Asha. I'm from Palo Alto, California, although right now I'm speaking to you from Ananda's Ashram in Gurgaon, India. It's a great joy for me to share with all of you, this being the first online program that I've done as part of the Ananda India series. So I look forward to this hour that we'll be spending together, and I hope that it will be the beginning of many such hours that we will have like this. This evening I've been asked to speak about the subject, driving the chariot of the mind. I've been spending a little time this afternoon thinking what the intention of that might be, and so I will launch forth boldly and see if we can at least make something spiritually useful out of this idea. I was reflecting on something that Swamiji writes when he writes about Master. And he talked about how Master had been a master for such a long time. It's sort of funny when he puts it like that, but that is how he said it. That his realization was achieved long before he incarnated in the form that we knew and called Paramhansa Yogananda. He was not a soul who attained his realization in that incarnation or was struggling against the attraction of delusion and having to discipline himself in restraint from the world, that he was able in himself to always hold his God consciousness effortlessly, that everything that had to be resolved had been resolved incarnations ago. And then Swamiji said he wore his wisdom like a comfortable old jacket, something that it was so natural to him. And because of that, Swamiji described how Master could participate in life without any inhibition. Of course, the inhibition of the refinement of his own consciousness and his divine perception was always there. It wasn't that he was uninhibited in the sense of indulging in things that were unsuitable, but he was able to fully engage his loving nature and his desire to help and uplift people. He didn't have to think about holding on to a particular consciousness. Many of the things that Swami Kriyananda wrote about his guru also described Swamiji. In fact, at one point I said something to Swamiji because in the early years of Ananda, the direction we were going, even the role Swamiji was playing, was not as clear-cut as it became over time. In a similar way, again, Swamiji talked about Master, that when Master first arrived in America in 1920, he himself was a man in his 20s. He was a young man at the beginning of his life mission, with all of that power in place and that determination that the Masters had filled him with to fulfill this East-West union, this message of Kriya Yoga, everything that later became manifest. But when he first arrived, he was an Indian Swami alone in America at a time when such a thing was a unique phenomenon. Hardly any Indian Swamis had even touched the soil of America, what to speak of dedicating themselves as Master did to the work that he did. And people simply didn't know who he was. Autobiography of a Yogi wasn't published for 25 years. And so people had to people saw Master in whatever capacity they had for being able to see him. Someday much more of that history will be written. Swamiji has written Paramhansa Yogananda biography, which gives us a much clearer picture of Master's work in America as he actually lived it. But in time, many more details will come forth, and we'll be able to feel that experience more vividly, which I think will be important not only for understanding Master's mission, but also for understanding what it is to be a devotee, the example that Master set. Well, in this context, I once asked Swamiji, I said, everything that you're doing at Ananda, the way you're establishing things, the way you're training us, the way you yourself express, it's all because that's the way that Master did things, isn't it? Swami just smiled at me and said, of course. And those things that you refrain from doing or suggest that are really not the right direction for us, that's because that's not the way Master did it or would have done it. So again, Swami just smiled at me and said, of course. And so much of the time when Swamiji's talking about Master's consciousness or his attitude toward life or his definition of his mission or the way he works in the world, Swamiji was also describing himself. And so in this particular aspect, Swamiji never claimed, Swamiji was not an avatar. He was not self-realized before he was born, but he was clearly and deeply established in a very high state of spiritual realization. Master told him, in fact, that his full freedom would come at the end of this incarnation, which was a mere 6 months ago now, in which the final freedom would be his. But because of that spiritual realization, which was manifest in so many ways, Swami Kriyananda also had that freedom to live in this world with a fully open heart and to relate to every reality in a spiritually appropriate way without the necessity to protect his own, as I said, his own realization. And as a consequence, he also set an example for all of us. Of course, that has to be followed judiciously, but he showed us what it is to be spiritually free. He showed us where we're going and laid down the formula for how to get there. And thinking of the topic that we're talking about, the chariot of your own mind, in other words, the moving force that we call ourselves. I think often about certain aspects of Swamiji and what it was really like to live closely with him. I was sharing in another program just a day or two ago about the unique quality that Swamiji had, which I would call this extraordinary balance between his reason and feeling, and the way he was able to access all aspects of himself according to what any situation required. I was always deeply inspired by the clarity of Swami Kriyananda's mind. He was a highly educated man and extremely articulate and knowledgeable about many subjects, and he could speak in a fascinating way about so many different things. In the last years of his life, in many ways, he no longer carried on the same personality. I think the personality was assumed for the benefit of all of us. And many, many examples of how his personality expressed himself are preserved in recordings, audio and video that were done over the 60 years of his service to God and Guru and to all of us, of his discipleship. But he always had this ability to penetrate to the heart of an issue and see realities there that often were missed by others, whether factual or emotional or personal, whatever they might be. And I used to try to understand, I would call the secret of that extraordinary clarity of mind, because it was a virtue was a quality that I admired. And it being my own inclination, it was spiritually relevant for me to learn how to emulate him in all aspects that were, as I say, part of my own nature too. And I began to realize that the reason Swamiji's perception of reality was so clear was because he was completely unafraid in his heart. He was unafraid for himself. You know, so many of us have so many aspects of our own nature that we are unwilling, or at the very least reluctant, to face. Qualities of attachment, desires that we might have, responses to life that don't fit our picture of the ideal disciple, or even on a less than conscious level, We have preferences. We have likes and dislikes of the heart. It's the likes and dislikes of the heart, the sages tell us, that actually bind us to delusion. It's not participating in this world that binds us. It's participating in duality, of not seeing the singularity of the spirit behind everything, but always dividing the world up into our likes and dislikes. And we do it almost unconsciously. Oh, that's an attractive color. That looks like a nice person. He doesn't look like someone I would like to know. That architecture is ugly. That house is nice. Now, there's a difference between perceiving things as they are, because as Sri Yukteswar says in Autobiography of a Yogi, saintliness is not dumbness. It's not like when we become spiritual, we become less capable of functioning in the world. Quite the opposite. We become extremely keen in our discernment of shades of meaning and qualities of consciousness. But where we become bound to delusion is when our happiness is dependent on reality matching our preferences, or even more deeply, when we're unable to perceive things as they are, because the prejudices of our likes and dislikes just make it impossible for us to see things clearly. I know all of us, most of us at least, have been one time or another deceived in our perception of people, or deceived in our perception of a situation. And only later, and oftentimes amusingly, in retrospect, it's obvious that we simply didn't want to know. I remember when one of my friends embarked on a course of action that seemed self-evidently unwise and doomed to lead to unhappiness. I felt out of friendship to her that I should at least try to warn her about the obvious disaster she was heading into. So I vividly remember, as lovingly as possible, but clearly, I spoke to her and I said, I really don't think this is going to work out well, and I think you should consider seriously before you commit yourself to this. And we had that conversation, and she went forward anyway. It took several years for the train to wreck, as it inevitably did, and for her to pick herself out of the train wreck and go on. And quite a long time later, I happened to mention to her that I had warned her. She absolutely insisted that I had not. And in fact, she said, why didn't you say something to me? And I told her the time and place in which we had spoken, and as far as she was concerned, it never happened. Now, you can see how much just that simple desire, she had a desire to go forward in that way, and she just couldn't hear anything else. I remember being once, more than once, but one particular example, Swami Kriyananda was trying to help a man in our community who again was embarking on a course of action that Swamiji thought was not going to end well for him. And Swamiji wanted to spare him the karmic trouble that course of action was going to create for him. And the man sat right in front of Swamiji, and I have to add, I have a very clear memory in general where people are concerned, and particularly where Swami Kriyananda is concerned. It's been tested many times, so that's not just a personal claim of mine. So of course there could be differences of opinion, but this is what I believe happened. The man sat in front of Swamiji. He described the course of action he wanted to take. Swamiji said, he said this exactly, I don't think that it is spiritually necessary for you to go through that particular cycle. And the man listened, walked out of the room, and said to me, isn't it wonderful that Swamiji is in favor of what I'm going to do? And I mean, it was a minute earlier, and I had learned some sense of restraint by that point. And I just said, oh, just like, I just didn't know what else to say. We'd both been present, that's what had happened, and there it was. I told Swamiji later, but he'd done everything he could. So again, the man went through the cycle. It ended with great difficulty. He had caused a lot of troubles that had to be overcome, and eventually he managed to make the full circle and come right back to where he was started and then go on from there, and no permanent damage was done. Now, these are examples when the chariot of our mind drives us, and our higher self, at least, is not fully engaged. With Swamiji, what I've noticed is that his commitment has always been to truth. And truth he also defines as being helpful and being kind. Truth is not just the brutal, ruthless truth. In the instances that I described to you, I've learned from Swami that truth is helpful. It's not just a question of the facts. It's also a question of the consciousness with which you express it and people's readiness to hear. Truth has many levels, and people can only perceive what they're able to perceive, and you don't serve them by battering down their defenses and trying to force them to understand something if they're not ready and willing to hear it. But Swamiji has always expressed his spiritual interest as being a deep devotion to what is true. And many times, if you read through his writings and his speaking, he has a certain theme. We have to perceive reality as it is. We can't hide from what is. We have to work with things as they are. And I began to see, over the course of knowing him, that this fearlessness on his part to know what was really happening, what God intended, and what the reality was on all levels, was the reason his mind was so clear. Because he wasn't blocking out pieces of reality in order to comfort his ego nature. There was no ego nature to comfort. And again, because of that, he could give himself so completely to situations because he had nothing to fear. Whatever happened would happen, and there was no necessity to protect himself from it. I remember a particular circumstance Swamiji was in where he embarked upon a course of action, and that course of action became very public. And in fact, we solicited information. We solicited the opportunity to communicate on a national and an international basis. He was setting new directions for his own life, for the life of the community. And within a few months, that direction just proved impossible to follow. We didn't get cooperation that we expected, and it just fell apart almost before we had even published the story about the new directions. The new directions had been completely changed. And I remember after all of that happened, just sitting comfortably in Swami's living room, and he was looking at a small group of us, and he put it like this. He said, if I chose to be, I could be quite embarrassed. He said, but I choose not to be. Now, what he's describing there is what it means to be in command of your own consciousness. Because what we're talking about here in the chariot of the mind is to be in command of our own consciousness. And that doesn't mean that we never falter, that we never find ourselves heading in directions that seem like a good idea at the time, but just don't work out in the way we expect. It's impossible to think, it's not realistic to think that we're never going to make errors. That's our karmic lot. If we weren't going to make mistakes, we'd already be freed. By definition, we're here to work out our karma, and that karma is going to take us down a lot of interesting pathways that may not necessarily in the end prove to be what we expected them to be. So sometimes we can't avoid the pitfalls, and too great an effort even to avoid them doesn't even serve us spiritually. I remember Swamiji talking once about emotional states and all of the things that people can get into. And he made a very powerful and important statement. He said, it's better to be over-emotional in the way we relate to life, to be even overreactive and just too engaged on exactly what I was speaking about moderating, which is the likes and dislikes of the heart. He said it's far better to have our energy be running a little bit out of our control than it is to be too self-censoring, is the word he used. Because if we're self-censoring, you see, nothing is resolved. It's merely held in check, waiting for the moment when it can be expressed. Even if it's way down in the darkness of our unconscious, it's still there, and suppression is not the same as resolution. He says, at least if the energy is flowing, at least if those realities are coming out in front of us and the often unfortunate consequences of our undisciplined feelings are manifesting all over the place, we can at least then work with them. And we're making progress in resolving them by at least having the courage to express them. Whereas being afraid even to show ourselves who we are just simply postpones the inevitable day when we'll have to face it. Swamiji, in his incredibly well-crafted wordsmithing, said many people are good merely because they lack the energy to sin. And it's such a fabulous way to put it. In fact, in The Path, or perhaps in Conversations with Yogananda, Swamiji talks about a conversation in which Master was talking to the celibate monks about the necessity to control the impulse toward sexuality and toward attraction toward the women and so on. And he pointed to a certain monk and held him up as an example of someone who seemed very, very restrained in that side of his life. And then one of the other monks said to Master, "But he doesn't have any energy at all." And Master laughed and had to admit that that did rather disqualify him as an example. That it wasn't really that he was pious, but he simply lacked the energy to sin. And Swamiji said, we have to become energetic enough to be able to see who we are. Now, also in Conversations with Master, with Yogananda, a superb book, as all of Swamiji's are, but one that I happen to have been reading lately, there was a whole section in there that, you know, the thing about Swamiji's writing and Master's writing is that it's so multi-leveled and so subtly written that we can read the same books for a lifetime. Just to digress a little, the Art and Science of Raja Yoga was first published as 14 Steps to Self-Realization or to Awareness. It was first published in 1969, and it wasn't book form, it was a notebook full of lessons. And I had those same lessons for 25 years. I had coffee stains and tea stains and all my little writings in them, and I would reread them periodically. And I would find paragraphs that I myself had highlighted, so I must have read them. But it was like a totally new idea to me. It's like I'd never seen it before, because I pray, my own vibration had shifted. And so now I could see something in there that I just was not able to see before. So in Conversations with Master, Swamiji writes about how Master, rather than trying to suppress people's limitations or misunderstandings, he often did just the opposite and actually tried to draw those qualities out of them and did things to encourage their delusions rather than to combat them. You know, our thinking about how spiritual growth takes place is often quite confused. And it's very important for us to tune in to those finer points as they present themselves to us, and do our very best to trace the implications of those. And this is one of them. And the example that Swamiji gives here is when Master came to America in those early years, and he was traveling across the country, and he had booked lectures in many of the major American cities, and he was enormously popular as a lecturer. He talked on so many different subjects. We get this, some of us receive this on this day in history, what Paramhansa Yogananda was doing for various years. You can find that and subscribe to it on the ananda.org website. It's very entertaining. And he talked on so many subjects: success, magnetism, healing. The subject I saw recently that he talked on was the similarity between Judaism and Hinduism. I was raised Jewish. I don't know what the similarities are. I would like to hear that lecture. And that was just one of many. He gave subjects on Hindu literature, Indian fiction, playwrights of ancient India, just anything to get people into an understanding of the message that he had to bring. And at the beginning, people didn't know who he was, and he had to take whatever help he could get. And he had someone who helped drive him, who drove his car. He hired a driver. And of course, no one crossed his path without a reason. But this was a man apparently of not very high consciousness, and he wasn't able to receive that much from Master. But Swamiji is explaining here that this man thought that Yogananda was very vain. How he decided that, who knows? Master was promoting himself and his ideas, and that's what he decided. But Swamiji writes that Master did everything he could to encourage the impression in this man's mind that Yogananda was very vain. And he talked about, Swami describes how Master before a lecture would stand in front of a mirror and primp, working on every curl of his hair, making sure that this man was watching him, and how Master would imitate sort of a vain person looking in the mirror and wanting everything to be just so. You can imagine extra things, asking him, how do I look? Do you think the scarf looks better like this or like this? So that the man's impression of Master as a vain person would increase. And the reason he did that is so that the man himself could see his own consciousness. You see, Master was a flawless mirror. He had no ego of his own. He had no need. It didn't matter to him whether he was perceived as a vain person or not. He knew who he was. Master knew who he was. He knew vanity had no part of his nature, but vanity had a huge part of this man's nature. So he wanted that man to see himself for what he was, so that he could decide whether or not that quality was an attractive one in him. In my own life, I incarnated into a family for which I am very grateful. I was well raised and well supported through my whole life, and even after my parents passed away, their generosity has been a great help to me. It's one of the reasons I'm able to be here in India even at this moment. But there were qualities in my family that instead of, again, balancing my faults, actually made some of them worse. And it used to irritate me, frustrate me. I was irritated with myself when I got on the spiritual path and began to understand that I chose that incarnation, or at least my soul had reasons for choosing it. I said to myself, talking to my superconsciousness, why didn't you choose a family that gave you the virtues you needed, or certain of the virtues you needed? Why did you incarnate in a situation that made bad things worse? But gradually, as I became more self-aware and watched other people, I began to realize that if those limitations in me had not been exaggerated by my upbringing, I would never have noticed them. The faults had to rise to a really big level before they intruded themselves sufficiently on my self-protection, my likes and dislikes, my self-image, all the things that keep us from being able to see ourselves clearly. You know, the fear of not measuring up, not being welcomed or accepted, you know, all the things that trouble us. But when the fault becomes large enough that everywhere you turn you're stepping on it, then all of a sudden we realize, oh, I really have to overcome this. So you see, Master helped us by pushing us toward those things. Isn't that odd? But we grow, you see, we grow from the inside out. Swamiji commented once on a certain popular teacher. Usually he kept himself deliberately uninformed about what other people were doing because he thought it was better not to have opinions. But he happened to be exposed to this man's way of being, and he was very popular, but not everlasting in his influence. The greatness of India is that truth gradually sorts itself out from fiction. And the greatness of true spirituality is that it endures, and that which is lesser just fades away. Well, this soul had his moment, and then he faded away. And Swamiji described him as trying to be spiritual from the outside. And this is a very subtle point and worth really thinking about. Swamiji talks about how true divine creation has to happen from the inside out. Everything that grows naturally always starts small. You know, the human being is the sperm in the ovum. I often just enjoy looking around at the people that I know, and you know, many human beings are quite sturdy. They make solid, large bodies, and they move through life with a lot of force. And you have to realize that every single one of us, not only did we start microscopically with the sperm and the ovum united, but we were little enough to grow in a woman's womb. And I often think about how odd it must be for mothers. I haven't raised children of my own, especially small women who eventually give birth to huge sons, to just look at these really big people walking around and imagine how tiny they used to be. Dear friends recently had a baby. The baby's days old now, and you see the picture of the father holding this tiny little person. And the father is actually quite a large man, at least tall man. And you know that inevitably this tiny form is going to become really quite substantial. But it all grows from the inside out. It grows like this. Now, by contrast, if you think about the exquisite sculpture that Michelangelo did of the David, if you've ever been to Florence and seen that in person, it has such a living magnetism that no picture that you've ever seen of it does justice. You're standing there and, I mean, it's huge, and it has the power of the artist's consciousness. But still in the end, it's just a block of marble. And you realize that Michelangelo did not make that from a microscopic sperm and ovum. He had a huge piece of marble, bigger than the finished David, and he just took something large and chipped it down a little bit. Because everything that is living has to expand itself, whether it's physically manifesting or expanding its consciousness. It has to start from the center, and then it expands outward. Spirit is center everywhere, and circumference nowhere. And our spiritual evolution, our gradual spiritual freedom, if you want to think about it like that, it's our freedom is something that gradually expands and expands. Freedom is an extremely important word on the spiritual path. Of course, the Sanskrit word for it is moksha, which has a more profound and nuanced meaning than the mere English word freedom. But freedom is also a very important concept, just like that, because the goal of the spiritual path is to free ourselves from all limiting identifications and compulsions, so that we can live in this world in perfect attunement and in perfect response to the inner prompting of the Spirit. Now, that's not always easy to do, because first of all, the challenge is to be able to discern among the many competing influences within us, which of those influences are superconscious and which are merely the subconscious rising up and wanting to hold us to the same pattern. I remember a friend of mine was talking to Swamiji, and Swamiji wanted to guide him in a certain direction, and it was a very challenging direction for that individual, because he was inclined to a certain creative pursuit. And Swamiji wanted him, for the time being, to refrain from following that creative impulse, and instead to try to get more deeply in tune before he expressed his own inner inspiration. That Swamiji felt that the artistic potential of that man would be greater if he held himself still for a while and tried to lift his consciousness higher and then created from that place, to become, as Swamiji put it, more original in his creativity, which is to say, to come more deeply from his own point of origin. The man was defending his present approach to life on the basis of how good he felt when he acted in that way. But after he left, I asked Swamiji a question, because Swamiji was training me during those years, and he often had me sit in at times when you might wonder why I was present. And afterwards he would often explain himself to me. Now I understand it's because he wanted me to speak of him and to write about him, and he wanted to make sure I understood. I said, Swamiji, it seems to me that this man is enjoying himself in this way, because what he's actually doing is he's closing everything off except his own present reality. And naturally, he feels really comfortable because there's nothing interfering with the vibration he has right now. And you see, that's the very subtle thing that we get caught in, even when we try to be inspired from the inside, is that there are many different voices inside of us. And some of those voices are very strong because they are the voice of who we have always been up until this moment. And often the voice that is calling us toward who we will become doesn't insist as loudly. Master wrote his book, Whispers from Eternity. Actually, I wish he said shouts from eternity, something that would break through our resistance to that subtle voice. But that subtle voice is the sperm and the ovum of our spiritual growth. It's that tiny whisper of divinity trying to push us to expand from where we are now. And this is why we have to be very discerning, very attentive, hopefully very respectful of those who have more experience than we do, and listen not only to what do I feel. I would, speaking of people's misunderstandings of Swamiji, it was very painful to me sometimes when Swami would speak very clear and simple truth to someone, and they would say, well, let me meditate and see what Master has to say. Now, for me, when Swami spoke, it was always Master speaking. And I always felt that Swamiji's chance of hearing Master's guidance was a lot better than mine. And if Swamiji offered it to me, I would listen. And instead of saying, well, let me check and see what I think, I would always try to feel first what he was saying, and then see how and in what way I could resonate with it. And if I didn't, rather than suspecting Swamiji's input, I was more inclined to suspect my own. And I can only say that over all the years of doing it, it served me extremely well. Of course I'm comfortable in who I am right now. I mean, that's why I am who I am right now. But who I am now is not who I want to be. Because time after time, coming back to this word freedom, I watch myself compelled by fear, compelled by desire. I was talking to a friend of mine who has, like me, a fairly quick reaction to life. And the virtue and the vice of being able to articulate that reaction, let's say faster than we can think about whether it's a good idea to articulate that reaction. And we were having a discussion about our shared mutual struggles, not only to speak clearly, but also to speak when appropriate, and not merely when we can. And we were talking about how often, in a sense, some inner compulsion forces us to speak. And I don't mean divine inspiration. Just the fact that there we are and let's say it. Or a response that comes that is really what I would have to call a fear-based response. In my marriage, naturally one learns when you live closely with someone. And my attachment in life has always been to my own ideas. I like my ideas. Many of my ideas are good. Some of them are terrible. But I tend to be fond of them. I'm a creative artist type. And so I like what comes through me, and I want to always go with it. And that can be so extreme that I'm very attached to my ideas. Let's call it having my own way. Sometimes it's because my ideas are better, but often it's just because they're mine. And sometimes when I see things going in a direction that I don't think is necessarily the right one, I will put this in the past. My attachment to having it my way can actually make me quite nervous if I think it's not going to work out if they go their way. And I began to be conscious of the fact that this was not wisdom. This was not carefully chosen, is this helpful response, which is how I saw Swamiji always behave. It was what I began to call my panic survival response. That somehow I thought the whole world would end if I didn't get my way. I mean, it's ridiculous when you say it like that, but it's not at all ridiculous when it's happening. And I began to realize that I wasn't able to discriminate clearly or fast enough when that anxiety was upon me. But I began to be able to find the symptoms of that anxiety, which in my case was an ever more rapid delivery of the words and an ever increasing tone of voice that would go higher and higher until I would become the hysterical chipmunk, might be a way to characterize it in the extreme. I characterize it in an exaggerated way with as much humor as I can bring to it so that it will make a deep impression on my mind. And this was a sadhana that I had to work through. I call it a sadhana because it was a spiritual practice. Whenever I heard that tone of voice, it didn't make any difference what I was saying. I was wrong. Because I was not acting from freedom. I was being compelled by the limitations of my own nature. And even if I was factually correct, I was karmically wrong. And this is how we have to work with ourselves. And I would then just stop. Just stop. In the middle of a sentence, if necessary, just stop. Because no good thing was going to follow if I was being compelled. Because freedom is the goal. Freedom to be absolutely in the center of our own nature and then follow only the beckoning of the divine, the call of our superconsciousness to respond according to God's will for the greater good of all. I watched Swami Kriyananda time and time again. He was always the master of his own energy, always. And no matter how seriously he was provoked, either by other people's unkindness toward him, or by their lack of understanding, or by the fact that once again he was having to offer a suggestion and hope that it would be accepted, certain qualities, certain projects in my nature that he had to work with, we revisited them again and again and again over the course of the years, and I have a good memory. And so when Swamiji would bring it up again, I knew he was repeating it, but he would often just bring up the same idea as if he'd never mentioned it before. Oh, here's an idea, and then I would sort of go along with it. Let's see if this time I'm actually going to be able to do it. And in a real sense, he was bringing it up for the first time because he was always in command of his energy. He didn't want anything. He didn't need anything from anyone or any situation. He was free. He was free and content within himself. Now, his example makes us know what it looks like. And we can measure that within our own selves. It's not that we should always be nice, and it's definitely not that we should be suppressed. Remember, Swamiji said, it's better to be over-expressive than to always be censoring ourselves so we don't even know who we are. So energy has to flow, but we need to watch it, and we need to pay attention. Is this freedom? And if this is compulsion, if I have no choice in what I'm expressing, what is motivating me? What am I afraid of? What am I attached to? And life itself will draw it out of us. Master will primp in front of the mirror. So our doubts about whether or not he's true will just become more and more exaggerated until we see that judgmental side of our nature. And then we get to ask ourselves, what do I really want? Who do I really want to be? Is this way making me happy? How is this working for me? Why do I keep falling into the same trap over and over again? What can I do about it? And I'm thinking now of a humorous story that I really want to tell you. This contradicts much of what I said, but it was such a fun moment with Swamiji. At a certain point, I realized it wasn't my panic survival response at that point. I wasn't tuned into that, but I realized sometimes I spoke without thinking and chattered too much and said things that really didn't need to be said. So I started this process. It just seemed like a good idea at the time, that if I found myself saying something I really didn't want to say, I would say, oh, never mind. I would just stop what I was saying. And sometimes I would even put my hand over my mouth. Oh, never mind, just like this. I mean, you can see how unpleasant that would be, but I didn't realize this. And I was sort of following this for a couple of weeks, thinking I was doing a really good job of molding my nature in a positive way. And I was working for Swamiji as his secretary at that time, and every afternoon at 4 o'clock, I and Seva and Kalyani and sometimes one or two others, we'd go over to Swamiji's house, we'd have tea together. We didn't have email, we didn't have telephones at that time. Swamiji's house was in an isolated area of our community. So at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we'd walk over the hill. We didn't have cars either. We'd bring the mail, remember the mail, paper mail, we'd bring it over, and we'd bring the news of the day, and we'd just have this gathering every afternoon. And we were together, and sometimes during those gatherings, I would do my little oh, never mind bit. And then it came to be the session was over, and we were beginning to leave. And I was standing in the doorway saying goodbye to Swamiji, and he looked right at me with this extremely serious expression. And he said, Asha, I was meditating today. And just the way he was starting, I mean, my spine stiffened, and I'm looking at him, I'm a deer in the headlights like this. He said, I was meditating today and Babaji came to me in my meditation. Oh my gosh, I'm just like this. And Babaji had a message for you. Oh, never mind. He said like that. I was, by this point, I was absolutely just in pieces. And he said, oh, never mind, like that. I got it instantly. Oh, I said, is it that irritating? He said, yes. Please don't ever do it again. He knew just how to get to me. He always knew that the way to catch me was with humor, the way to catch me was with fun, but I shook my head. I said, oh, Swamiji, you had me in the palm of your hand. And it was a great amusement to us. In fact, that story is in my book, Swami Kriyananda, as we have known him. And when I finished that book, or actually I wasn't quite finished with it, he invited me. I lived in California, where I still live, and he was living in Gurgaon, in the house we called Guru Kripa at that time. And he invited me over to India, and I stayed here for about 3 weeks, and he read through that manuscript, and then I wrote in his house some of the last stories and finished the book. He changed almost nothing in that book, but it was, of course, very helpful for me to have him read through it and confirm both my interpretation and my memory. But when he came to that story of the Oh, Never Mind story, he started reading it and I was sitting right next to him, and both of us started laughing. We just couldn't stop laughing. I think he himself was really pleased with that one. We were just in hysterics. There were others in the room and they didn't have any idea what we were laughing at, but it was a great moment. But as I said, that was a diversion to it, but he was always the master of himself. That's where I was going with that story. And it was an example well worth following. Now, I think we have a couple of questions that have come in from those of you who are watching, so let me see what I can do to answer them.
This first question is from Sanjay. How do we differentiate between the subconscious and superconscious influence to decide on our course of action?
That's a really excellent question. I mean, I just sort of casually told you there's two influences and one of them is helpful and one is not. It would be natural to ask how to tell the difference. Well, that's a fairly large question, but there's several ways. There's a very, very deep, uplifted calmness to superconsciousness. There's a subtlety of the vibration. The way you begin to recognize superconscious, there's always also, and this is probably the most important, there's always a completely very deep calmness to superconsciousness. Superconsciousness does not agitate our emotions. We don't feel suddenly anxious and compelled by superconsciousness. There's just a certainty that this is what I'm supposed to do. Subconsciousness often brings with it a certain amount of tension, or a certain amount of pride, or a certain amount of anxiety. Now, that alone is not the determining factor. Now, how do I exactly say this? I'm actually going to put it to you in a better way. It's very important in your life to have wise, impartial friends who will give you the impersonal truth when you yourself are not sure. I honestly think one of the best ways to tell is to ask someone whose impersonal wisdom you trust. I would not be telling you the truth if I said, oh, you can figure it out for yourself. I certainly could never figure it out for myself. And the way I learned to tell the difference was for many years I still have, but I cultivated a few relationships. Of course, Swami Kriyananda was one of them, but he was not the only one. I looked to my peers, people whose wisdom I had observed over time, and whose sincerity I trusted. And Master will use many instruments. We fall into this very dangerous delusion that God can only guide us through our own perception. Now think about that for a minute. If Master can speak to you, why can't he speak to someone else? And we become quite obsessed with this idea that I have to get my own guidance. Why? Why do you have to get your own guidance? Why can't Master speak to you through many, many, many sources? Now, this again is a fine line, but I honestly think, especially at the beginning of the spiritual path, that it's impossible to tell the difference. We just don't know how to tell the difference. So I'll speak from what worked for me. I would constantly bring my thoughts and my possibilities, not only to Swamiji, but to 3 or 4 other people in my life. This is what I'm thinking of doing. What do you think? And then I would really listen. And what happened over time is that by the response I got from other people, I began to be able to tell the difference in the vibration. I was saying there's a very different vibration, but it's subtle. And when I got consistently, when it felt like this, I was supported. And when it felt like that, people said, well, maybe you need to think about it. And of course, the other way is by the crash and burn method of spiritual learning, which also works. You just try, and you find out. Swamiji said to me once about me, oh, Asha, when your ego gets involved, you make terrible decisions. So make a lot of terrible decisions. Have the courage to make some really terrible decisions. And then you'll begin to feel it also from that. Oh, it felt like that. It didn't work out so well. And it felt like this, and it proved itself really to be the right one. It simply takes time. And it's a very fine skill, and you need a lot of help to develop it. But self-evidently, it's really worth developing. So, the second question?
The second question is from Sanjay Chakraborty. How do we keep an eye on our energy flow to avoid being a prey to delusions?
Well, yeah, I laugh at this. I was teaching classes once sequentially. I was teaching in 4 different cities. I was teaching a 4-week series, on Monday in one city, on Tuesday in another, Wednesday, Thursday, like this. And then I would start over again and do it again. I never teach from notes. I always respond to what's going on in the room. So even the same subject was very different in every single city. And after I finished the first week, and this was the first time I had done that, I had made no notes. I had no idea what had happened, and I was going to have to go back with part 2 in each place without having any idea what part 1 had been, really. And I said to Swamiji, who had done that same cycle for many years, Swamiji, how do I do this? How do I remember? And he said, by being completely conscious when you're teaching. Oh, I see. Well, no problem there. You know, it was like, that's advice to me. But I realized over time, in fact, yes, you can learn to be here now and to pay attention and to be very sincere in what you're doing, and then you activate a kind of grace within yourself. And so, let me say, first of all, it serves you nothing to worry about being in delusion. This is a strange thing about the spiritual path. Of course you're in delusion. Don't worry about it. Of course you're going to be in delusion for a really long time. Don't even imagine for a moment that you can stay out of delusion. Just when you notice, try to straighten yourself out. And then when you forget for a long time, and then you notice, don't worry about it. That's the process. Just be sincere in your desire to know the truth. Pay attention to what you're doing. And you'll see, God will be in there with you. Master will be in there with you, shining his light upon you. And pretty soon Swami's advice, oh, just be completely conscious while you're doing it. It won't sound so far out, because God will be in there helping you. And when you forget, he'll remind you. And step by step together, we move forward until moksha. Today or tomorrow, as Master said, it will come, it will come. God bless you. Okay, we drove the chariot of the mind right through that hour, didn't we? I was speaking American English perhaps a little too fast. I kept forgetting. Pardon me. Did you have a question?
No, I was just looking. I said, could we turn the heating on?
Oh, yes. First question, go right ahead.
That was the first question. Sorry.
If any of you all have further questions, I'm quite happy to. Thank you. To respond, anything else that you would like to talk about? There's something I was thinking of there I didn't have time to say. Oh, I remember it now, but it's not relevant now. What I was going to say is there's a lot of classes on my website called How to Know and Trust Your Inner Guidance, which is really what that man was asking, and it's worth looking at. So, is there anything else we can do if you're not anxious to go home? And if you are anxious to go home, please feel free to leave. May I do anything more for you or share anything more?
Ashaji, what happens to people who choose to be in delusion forever?
Forever?
Yeah. Like they're totally untouched by reality.
Master said that some souls that are in delusion at the beginning of the day of Brahma are still wandering in delusion at the end. I think what happens to them is this, you know, they just get to keep doing this. And some people don't seem to care. I mean, others of us feel the limitations of egoic living so acutely that we can't stand it. And we feel the pain of the inevitable disappointments of this life so acutely that we can't stand it. And other people just don't. They're not having the experience that we're having. Because if they were, they would be on the spiritual path. I'm not being recorded now, am I?
You are, but you don't have to.
Okay, well, let me just think about this for a second. Okay, I'll tell the story without naming names. No, it's fine. Since everything goes out on the internet, I often have to think. Someone I knew who had been married for a very long time, his wife became ill. And she was not young, but she died 20 years before he expected her to die. And they had been married, they'd been together since they were teenagers. And so it was very, very difficult for the man who was left behind. He'd hardly ever been a person, and he'd never been a grown man without his wife. And they had no spiritual tradition to speak of, very external spirituality, nothing inside. But a very successful, socially successful, prominent, and my husband and I went to the funeral, and I mean, it was so painful. It was just agonizing. And there was so much that we knew we could offer, and absolutely none of it could be offered, because there was no connecting link, you know. In India, at least, there's shared understandings. Even the most materialistic person has some context. In America, there's nothing. If there's nothing, there's nothing. And I was just suffering so much from this whole situation. And then this thought crossed my mind. Oh yes, of course. It's this kind of suffering that puts you on the spiritual path. It's having everything just right and then having it all awful, just losing everything. Oh yeah, that's why I was born into very fortunate circumstances with an absolute desperate desire to get out of that. Even though nothing was painful, I was intensely desirous of escaping suffering that I didn't seem to be experiencing. And that was when Swamiji said to me, past lives. And in that moment, I just completely relaxed. With everybody suffering, say I became joyful would be to overstate it, but I became completely calm. Because of course these people have to go through this. How did I ever get on the spiritual path? It was from this. So how long people want to go through that, that's the question people are always asking me. What about free will? Well, the free will you have is to suffer. As long as you want to suffer. Truth is right in front of you. And if you don't want to know it, you get to not know it. And the only thing that happens to you is this, which I find unbearable, and other people don't. My own dear mother, who was a sweet woman, when she was at the end of her life, we did not share a spiritual understanding, but I wanted to help her. So I asked her if she was afraid of dying, or how she felt about dying. And she said she wasn't afraid, but she sort of looked around, and you know, she remained interested in the American presidential elections and all sorts of things. I wanted to say, why are you still thinking about that? But I didn't, because I've learned a little bit, so I didn't say anything. But she says, I hate to think of all this going on and me not being part of it. And I thought, wow, I love to think of all of this going on and me not being part of it. You know, that to me is such a happy thought. But there we are. You know, I came out of her womb, but there we are. And it was fine. She progressed in many ways, but there you are. Yeah. Yes.
Ashaji, at your workplace, when you're able to identify something that is out from the subconscious and it's getting you to probably be the way you used to be, but you're not comfortable with it.
Right.
And you're trying to deal with it in a way that you feel will be the right energy to put out. But until it works out eventually, you're not comfortable looking at it or facing it or being in that situation again so easily as you could be eventually. What do you do during that time when you're trying to continuously put out the right energy, but it's very difficult because you haven't really unlearned what you have to learn?
Right. It's very important to appreciate the fact that there are stages of growth, that we simply do not get to the goal without walking the path. And therefore, we are going to be at some stage of development at all times until we are free. And no amount of impatience or disappointment or tears or guilt is going to have any effect on it. It's like when I left home, someone had given us a hyacinth plant, the flower, the hyacinth, and it was just the bulb in this little glass jar, and you could see the roots coming and the little sprout was coming up, and I knew that I was going to be away from home for 8 weeks, and the chances are really great that the hyacinth is going to bloom and die before I get back to see it. And so I kept looking at that hyacinth on the shelf, and I kept trying to think if I could persuade it to bloom before I left, you know? And there was absolutely no chance. It was a very sincere little hyacinth, and I think it wanted to please me, and I was watering it carefully and keeping it in a nice spot. But it just couldn't do it. It had to sort of squiggle up as its little green. And of course, it's obvious what I'm saying to you. It doesn't really make any difference how sincere you are or how impatient you are, you're just going to grow as fast as you're going to grow. And so we also have to have a strategy that's based on what's realistic. You know, we had to keep watering that hyacinth and keep it in the window. I couldn't take it to India with me in my suitcase. I had to relate to it as it really is. So you can say to yourself, it would be nice if I were over this quality, but the fact of the matter is, I'm not. And therefore, let's use an example that if I try to talk to this man about this particular subject, I'm likely to throw hot coffee in his face. So I think it would be a good idea for me not to be alone with this man if we have to talk about it. We have to have a realistic strategy for being who we are. We might say, as long as there's 3 or more in the room, I can talk to him. I can write my ideas. We can email, but we can't talk face to face. And that's not a compromise at all. That's, in fact, being exactly appropriate and being exactly who you are. If you think of it like a spectrum, you know, this might be where you're eventually going to be, but if you're only halfway there, then be halfway. Don't fall down to the bottom. Just be the best you can be, given who you are. There are many situations in the community that my husband and I have been guiding for many years. And sometimes people will ask things of me or want my involvement in something, and I will often just say to David, you know, I can't do that. I don't have the patience, I don't have the kindness, I don't have the simpatico with the person who's asking it of me, and I don't have to go to that person and tell them all my faults, but I have to work realistically with it. And if you work realistically with it, gradually you get strong here, then you can push it to there. And, you know, as they say, patience is the fastest route to success. And that's really also being patient with ourselves, okay? It's a very good question. Thank you for asking that. Yeah. Any other?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Do you see how the degree of evolution, how far a person has evoluted, if that word exists? When you see somebody?
You mean, do I have
you person, yes.
Me personally? No, I think is the first answer, but then I'll modify it a little. I mean, lest you all be nervous, just relax. But the fact of the matter is, that ability also comes with the generosity of heart to be loving no matter what you see. And so Master was asked, this was in conversations with Yogananda, can you tell immediately what a person's state of evolution is? And Master said, of course, oh yes. I mean, just instantly is what he said. He said, but I don't go into a person unless Divine Mother invites me, or tells me, or that person invites me. Now, I'm just not that evolved, honestly. But of course, we all have certain sensitivities. And so we all feel each other's energy to a large extent. And so in that sense, you know, I'm not entirely blind either. But God doesn't use me in that way. If He wants to, He'll give me the ability. But it's not my role. My role is this. I had the good fortune to meet Swami Kriyananda at a very young age, when he was at a stage of life when it was possible for a person such as myself, who had a sincere desire to learn, to be in his company a great deal. I also had the very good karma to somehow understand who he was, literally from the first time I saw him, to understand his spiritual reality and his role as Master's emissary in this world. So then I had a lot of opportunities to see him up close, and for his own reasons, he answered my questions and often explained himself to me. Not always, but often. I have a very good memory for those experiences. I have a knack for understanding how they apply, for using that knowledge creatively. I have the gift of gab, and I have the freedom to do it. That's 100% of who I am.
There's one more question. Since you knew him for a long time.
Yes.
When I was reading this book, Two Souls and Four.
Yes, 2 souls, 4 lives. Yes.
It seemed to me that when he was describing himself, Henry the First.
Yeah.
He seemed to have been very much hurt by the things that had happened before with the society in America.
You mean in this incarnation? The later 2 lives.
There was a lot of there were a lot of similarities between the 2 lives.
Yes.
My question is though, you knew him.
Yes.
Was he personally very hurt, Swami?
That's a very good question. You're asking good questions. Okay, let me try to think this one through. First of all, bear in mind that book was written by Catherine Kaivari. It wasn't written by Swamiji, but nonetheless, yeah, I mean, her understanding of everything came from him, because how else would she know? You know, one of the reasons, of course, those parallels were drawn was because the whole experience that Swami Kriyananda had with Dhyamata, with SRF and Self-Realization Fellowship and just all of that is a very, very important history of Master's work. I mean, here's Yogananda incarnate. Here are these direct disciples. Here's this fracturing of Master's mission in the first generation. As Swamiji said to me, Christianity held together for 3 centuries, and look what a mess it was when it, for centuries, and look what a mess it's been and how much antagonism. You know, Master's work fracturing in the first generation is very disconcerting. So Swamiji was always trying to put all of that into context. And there was a feeling of it being very important for him. And there was definitely a feeling of involvement in that reality. Let me just try to think how to say this. I think on that level, even when a great soul incarnates, even when an avatar incarnates, as they explain it to us, they really take on the attributes of human life. Now, we take on the attributes of human life because we are compelled to take them on. We're attached to them. We want to experience, you know, material life. We want to experience sensuality. We want this person to belong to me. We have all these compulsions that we don't have a choice about. I lived a monastic life for many years. When my now husband David appeared in the ashram, it was kind of like the end of my monastic life, and it was just a pretty straight up relationship. I was a very happy monastic, but not happier than I was attracted to him. I said to Swami, as long as he's around, I'm not content anymore. And we worked with it for a while, and finally I married him. I've been very happy married to him. I would be happy to marry him 100 times more, but I would like not to be compelled to marry him the next time. You know, there was a compulsion in that involvement. I think it's been spiritually a very good thing, so it's not like it was wrong, but I did not act from freedom. I didn't have a choice. Now, that's what we feel when we get involved in these. Master also had very deep feelings about things, and he was very hurt when people betrayed him. He wept when people he loved died. He tried hard to help people. He participated completely in the feeling side of human life. And Swamiji asked Master, what is it like? He said, inwardly, you are always free. Now, it's a little bit hard for us to really put ourselves into what that means, but we can at least hear those words and meditate on them. So I saw for Swamiji that the small group of women, Ananda Mata, Mrinalini Mata, Daya Mata, those 3 women, Tara Mata, 4 women, you know, they were his best friends, and they were his spiritual peers. I often reflect on the fact that once he was expelled from SRF, he was 36 years old. He lived to be 86. He never had any peers after that. He had friends. You know, we were really his friends. We were more than just his devotees. We were really friends together. But he never had any peers. He lived his whole life without peers, because his peers had not only separated them from him, they had condemned and rejected him. Now, he would not have been an incarnated human if he didn't feel that really deeply in his heart. He felt it really deeply in his heart. He loved those women. He respected them. He shared the most important realities of his life with him, and then they shut the door on him. Now, was he always free in his heart? He said in those first months after he was expelled from SRF, and as he described it, he lay on the bed in the back bedroom of his parents' house, to which he was forced to return at the age of 36, penniless and friendless, and he prayed to die. That's how he felt. And then within a few months, he was called into public work by Dr. Haridas Chaudhry, who felt compelled to insist. And he sang and he spoke, and people spoke of the joy they felt from him. And Swami himself thought, joy? That is the last thing I'm feeling. But then he said when he went deeper, he realized that underneath it all, the joy was untouched. So again, we're seeing this fascinating example of what it really means to be a deeply spiritual person. You know, how it's exactly what we were talking about tonight. Because he was free, he could completely enter in. He didn't have to pretend that it doesn't matter to me, I'm above it all. He was able just to let the waves of feeling roll over him. Now that's the personal side of it. And I'll just make this this is a story that goes on forever. He was absolutely tenacious in his determined belief that if there was any possible way to repair the breach in Master's work, he was going to make that happen. And you know, up to the very end of his life, he was trying. And he never put it down. For the rest of us, it was like, please, can we just forget about those people? And I remember I said to him once, Swamiji, we don't like them, we don't need them, can we just put them aside? And this is just, you know, my immaturity. And that was when he said to me, Asha, look what happened to Christianity. And it held together for generations before it segmented. They have literally killed each other. He said, what will happen to Master's work if it fractures in the first generation? He said, I'm not thinking of the present. He said, I'm thinking of the ages. And of course then, you know, my little tiny perspective just backed up like that, and I understood what he was doing. And really, even in the last few years, I really got it on a much deeper level that this was really important. And even he wrote his last will and testament. And there's a paragraph in there that says, I want you and all future generations to understand that if there ever comes a time when Ananda and Self-Realization Fellowship can be reconciled, I want you to know that that is my wish. To the fact, you treated Kriyananda badly, we're not going to ever reconcile with you. He said, don't ever, and he said that to us often in person, don't ever think that I would want you to express your loyalty to me in that way. Your loyalty to me is to reconcile, if with integrity it can be done. And let's see, there was one last final thought. Oh, and this is the last thing which I believe motivated him deeply, which was the leaders of Self-Realization Fellowship, past and present, are his gurubhais. And the leaders, most of whom have passed from this planet, but not all, were his peers. And in some cases, with all due respect, perhaps, well, I won't say one way or another. He felt responsible for helping them. Because I sincerely believe, and he did too, that they had taken a wrong turn. And he never gave up the thought that if he could just find one more way of saying it, then perhaps they would understand. And so a lot of what he was doing, which many people did not understand, I felt he was trying to reach them with it. And he didn't care what he looked like. He didn't care what people thought. He was there to help. And he was right. Who else on this whole planet could help them? Because the way they structured themselves, they insulated themselves from any input that disagreed with them. So he was the only voice that could ever get through. So he kept standing on the balcony sending out the message. And as I said, toward the end of, I always supported him and reserved judgment. But toward the end, I really began to feel it from his point of view. And the more deeply I felt it, the more profoundly I respected what he was doing. And eventually, to the extent that I am able, I really feel like I embraced it. That I was not only being dutiful to him, but I really understood. Not that there's anything I personally can do about it now, but if the time comes. I was often one of the most outspoken people in our many controversies with Self-Realization Fellowship, but in a paradoxical way, I somehow also have really been able to see their point of view. And so I'm actually more easily able to see their point of view than many people who have been less outspoken against them. Odd, but that's how it works. So I really get what they're doing, and I understand the sincerity of it, and I would like to see it resolve. Okay? Yeah. Anything else on that? Or anything like...
Get to be fearless?
Ah, step by step. Fear is tricky. Fear is really tricky. You just have to become conscious of its potential and just struggle against it. And I think you have to fight the battles you can win. It's folly to put yourself in harm's way, whether it's emotional or spiritual or physical, unless it's an appropriate challenge. You know. But everything about the spiritual path is just step by step. The fundamental issue is to be as conscious as you can be, to be as conscientious as you can be, to be as wide awake as you can be, and to, well, I didn't have time to tell this story, so I'll tell it now. There was a man living in our community in Palo Alto who was making some really bad decisions, really, really bad decisions. And they were so bad that I called Swami Kriyananda on the phone because I couldn't influence him. Swamiji, this man is really making bad decisions. And he said, he won't listen to me. I can't get through to him at all. So Swamiji called him on the phone, and as it happened, I was there. And so the man, Swamiji said, would you please come from Palo Alto to Ananda Village? He said, because they were close. He said, you know, Swami said it very kindly, I'd really like to talk over with you, you know, the decisions, the directions you're planning to go, and I'd like to just talk to you about it. And the man said, because we were able to be very frank with Swamiji, he said, yes, I'd be happy to talk to you, but the situation is very complicated, and I really want you to understand it's going to take me at least an hour to explain it all to you. Swami said, yes, of course, as much time as you need. And then he hung up the phone. And then later I'm back on the phone with Swamiji, and Swami says to me, truth can be spoken in a moment. He said, self-justification, that takes a long time. So pay attention. Whenever you find yourself saying, well, you just don't understand, and that particular tone of voice comes in. Maybe they do understand. Maybe they understand all too well. When you just hear yourself explaining it. Try to get the generic clues that are symptoms of the same fundamental problem. You know, for me, it's the voice gets faster and faster and the words get higher and higher. Like that. And whatever I'm saying, it's wrong. Or and so you see, then I felt like this, and then when that happened, it occurred to me that maybe this was part of it, and if that was part of it, then this was involved, and all of a sudden you think, what? You know, you just begin to, it's a vibration, it has external marks to it. You find that, you know, you're sitting like this, or you're sitting like this, and just when you see your hands like that, you realize this is wrong, something is wrong. And if you're conscientious, you'll just gradually begin to notice, and then the hyacinth will become a flower. But it just takes time. You know, my honest answer to that question, which I'm asked 1,000 times in 1,000 ways, is I have no idea how change actually happens. I have just observed that if you don't give up, it does. And truthfully, that's really the only thing I know, because I think God gets tired of you, and He gradually fixes you. You know, He just gets bored with you being like that. That's not very scientific, and that is not in Conversations with Yogananda. I just made it up. But that's what it feels like. I really don't know why suddenly what was a big problem isn't. I'm just so relieved when I notice. You know, wow, look at me, I was nice. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you very much. It's just been a pleasure to have a little time. And I'm sorry I froze you out. We should have kept the heater on.
Just about.
You were just, yeah. Yeah.